Have you ever made a split-second decision that completely changed your life? I did. When I saw that soldier standing alone in the pouring rain, I had no idea that letting him sleep in my truck would bring a squad of police officers to my doorstep the very next morning. Stay with me until the end to discover why this random act of kindness turned my world upside down in ways I never could have imagined. Welcome to Honor Echoes, where we share the untold stories of veterans and the people whose lives they've touched. Before I reveal what happened after I opened my door to those officers, make sure you subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that show the true impact of military service. Now let me tell you my story. It was a Friday evening in late October when I first met him. The kind of autumn night where the rain feels like it's trying to wash away the world. I'd just finished my shift at Parker's hardware store in Millfield, a small town where most people know each other, at least by face. But I'd never seen him before. I remember walking to my truck in the far corner of the parking lot, the one spot under a broken light where nobody wanted to park. That's when I noticed him. A tall, lean figure in a military jacket, soaked to the bone, standing with perfect posture despite the weather beating down on him. He wasn't asking for anything, wasn't panhandling or looking for attention. He was just standing there, as if waiting for orders that would never come. Something about his stance, the way he held himself with dignity, even while drenched, made me slow down. I'm not typically the kind of person who approaches strangers. In fact, my ex-wife used to joke that I had stranger danger worse than our kids. But there was something in his eyes when he turned toward my footsteps, a mixture of pride and profound weariness that I recognized from my own father, who'd served in Vietnam. "You okay, man?" I called out, already feeling the rain seeping through my jacket. He straightened up even more, if that was possible. "Yes, sir. Just waiting for the bus." His voice was steady, controlled, but I could see him shivering. I glanced at the bus schedule posted nearby. "Last bus left an hour ago," I told him. "Next one's not until tomorrow morning." Something flickered across his face, not panic, but a momentary crack in that military composure. Then it was gone, replaced by a curt nod. "I see. Thank you for the information." He made no move to leave, and I realized he had nowhere to go. The nearest motel was 15 miles out of town, and in this weather, walking wasn't an option. I stood there for a moment, rain dripping from my baseball cap, having an internal debate that felt much longer than the few seconds it actually took. "Look," I said finally, "I've got a truck with an extended cab. It's not the Hilton, but it's dry. You can crash there for the night if you need to." He studied me with eyes that seemed to be assessing potential threats, another habit I recognized from my father. "That's very kind, but I don't want to impose." "It's not an imposition if I'm offering," I replied, then added, "My dad was 3rd Infantry Division. I know what it's like." That seemed to register. He didn't smile. I would learn later that Staff Sergeant James Mercer rarely smiled, but he gave me a nod that somehow conveyed more gratitude than words could have. "Staff Sergeant James Mercer," he said, extending a hand that was steady despite the cold. "Recently discharged." "Mike Holloway," I replied, shaking his hand. "Hardware store assistant manager and owner of a dry truck." We walked to my Ford F-150, and I opened the back door to the extended cab. It wasn't much, but it was clean, and I always kept a blanket and pillow back there for those times when I'd drive out to Miller's Lake for early morning fishing. "I can't offer much," I said, "but it'll keep you dry for the night. There's a blanket and pillow. The seats recline a bit." He surveyed the space with the same assessing look he'd given me. "This is more than enough, sir. I appreciate it." "Mike," I corrected him. "Just Mike." For a moment, I wondered if I should offer him a ride somewhere, or maybe invite him back to my apartment. But something told me that wouldn't be welcome. This man had his pride, and accepting the truck for shelter was already testing the limits of what he was comfortable with. "I'll be back around 7 tomorrow morning," I told him, handing him the spare key I kept in my wallet. "Lock it if you go anywhere. There's a gas station with a bathroom just down the block if you need it." He took the key carefully, like I was handing him something precious. "I'll make sure everything is exactly as you left it, sir. Mike." "I know you will," I said, and strangely enough, I did know. There was something in his bearing that spoke of absolute reliability. What I didn't know was that this simple act would set in motion a chain of events that would change both our lives forever. I walked the 8 blocks to my apartment, getting soaked in the process, but not minding much. I'd done a good thing, I thought. Dad would have been proud. It wasn't until I was toweling off my hair that a flicker of doubt crept in. I'd just given my truck and a spare key to a complete stranger. What if he drove off with it? What if he was dangerous? But then I remembered his eyes, the way they'd reminded me of my father's, tired but honorable. No, I decided. I'd made the right call. Still, I sent a quick text to my buddy Dave, who worked the night shift at the police station, just letting him know what I'd done and the soldier's name, just in case. Dave replied with a thumbs up emoji and, "Good man, I'll keep an eye out, on patrol." That night, I slept surprisingly well for someone who just left a stranger in his truck. Maybe it was because I felt I'd done something my father would have approved of. Dad had always said that how we treat veterans shows what kind of nation we really are. The next morning, I woke up early, grabbed some coffee from my kitchen, and made 2 more cups in to-go containers. I added sugar and cream packets since I didn't know how Sergeant Mercer took his coffee. I also packed up a couple of egg sandwiches I'd quickly made. It wasn't much of a breakfast, but it was better than nothing. The rain had stopped overnight, leaving behind that fresh, clean smell and a sky that promised a beautiful day. As I approached the parking lot, I could see my truck was still there, which sent a wave of relief through me that I hadn't even realized I needed. As I got closer, I noticed something else. The truck looked cleaner than when I'd left it. The windows, which had been streaked with rain and road grime, were now crystal clear. Sergeant Mercer was standing at attention beside the truck, as if reporting for duty. He'd folded the blanket into a perfect military square and had the pillow sitting on top of it. The key I'd given him was placed carefully on the dashboard. "Good morning, Mike," he said, that same formal tone in his voice. "Thank you for the accommodation." "Morning," I replied, handing him the coffee and sandwich. "Thought you might be hungry." He accepted them with a nod of thanks. "I took the liberty of cleaning your windows and organizing some items in your cab. I hope that was acceptable." I glanced inside and saw that the pile of receipts, spare change, and random items that had accumulated in my center console were now neatly arranged. My coffee cup holders, which had been sticky with old spills, were spotless. "You didn't have to do that," I said, surprised. "Small payment for the shelter," he replied simply, taking a sip of the coffee. We stood there in awkward silence for a moment, 2 strangers connected by a single night of unexpected kindness. I noticed that his clothes, though no longer dripping, still looked damp and uncomfortable. "So, what's your plan now?" I asked finally. He squared his shoulders slightly. "Bus comes at 8:15. I'm heading to Cedar Rapids. My sister lives there." I nodded, glancing at my watch. It was only 7:20. "You've got some time to kill then. Why don't you come back to my place? You can dry your clothes, get a proper shower if you want." He hesitated, and I could see him weighing his pride against practicality. "That's very generous. But look," I interrupted, "my dad would haunt me from the grave if I let a soldier go on his way in wet clothes when I could help. It's no big deal." Something shifted in his expression at the mention of my father again. A recognition of the code that existed between those who served, and those who understood what that service meant. In that case, I accept. Thank you. We drove the short distance to my apartment in a silence that was surprisingly comfortable. My place wasn't much, a one-bedroom on the second floor of an old converted house, but it was clean and had a decent shower with good water pressure. "Bathroom's through there," I said, pointing. "I'll find you some dry clothes. We look about the same size." While he showered, I dug through my dresser and found a pair of jeans, a flannel shirt, and a clean t-shirt that looked like they might fit him. I set them outside the bathroom door and called out that they were there. 20 minutes later, he emerged looking considerably better. The clothes fit reasonably well, though the jeans were a bit short on his tall frame. His dark hair was neatly combed, and without the rain and exhaustion shadowing his features, I could see he was younger than I'd initially thought. Probably early 30s, about my age. "I can't thank you enough," he said, his voice less formal now. "It's been a while since I've felt this human." "Don't mention it," I replied, suddenly uncomfortable with his gratitude. "Coffee's still hot if you want more." He accepted another cup, and we sat at my small kitchen table. That's when I noticed the scars on his hands, old burns that created a web of pale tissue across his knuckles and disappeared up his sleeves. He caught me looking and simply said, "IED, outside of Kandahar, 3 years ago." I nodded, not pushing for more. My father had been the same way, offering only the briefest explanations for the scars he carried, both visible and invisible. "Is that when you got out?" I asked. "No," he replied, rotating the coffee cup in his hands. "I did another tour after rehab. Got out 4 months ago." "And now you're heading to your sister's?" He nodded, trying to figure out what's next. "Civilian life is an adjustment." The way he said it spoke volumes. I remembered my father's struggles after Vietnam, how he'd found it hard to relate to people who hadn't experienced what he had, how ordinary problems had seemed trivial after what he'd been through. "My dad used to say the same thing," I offered. "Took him years to feel like he belonged back home. But he made it. Built a good life." Sergeant Mercer, James as he'd told me to call him, looked up with a hint of curiosity. "What did he do? After the service?" "Became a carpenter," I said, with a small smile. "Said he needed to create things after seeing so much destruction. He was good at it too. Half the custom cabinets in this town were his work." A ghost of a smile touched James's lips. "I like that. Creating after destruction. Makes sense." We talked for another hour, finishing our coffee and the rest of the egg sandwiches. He told me a little about his time in Afghanistan, mostly the mundane parts, the dust that got into everything, the stray dogs that followed their unit, the local children who would trade information for candy bars. I told him about the hardware store, my divorce 2 years ago, my hopes to own my own place someday. By the time we looked at the clock, it was almost 8. "I should get to the bus station," he said, standing up. "I'll drive you," I offered immediately. The bus station in Millfield was just a bench outside the post office with a small sign. When we arrived, there were a few other people waiting already. James gathered the plastic bag containing his wet clothes and turned to me. "I don't know how to repay you for your kindness," he said, extending his hand. I shook it firmly. "No repayment necessary, just pay it forward someday." He nodded, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "My sister's contact information, and mine. If you're ever in Cedar Rapids." I took the paper, touched by the gesture. "Thanks. Take care of yourself, James." "You too, Mike." I watched him walk to the bench, still carrying himself with that military bearing. As I drove away, I felt good. Better than I had in a long time. Sometimes the smallest actions, the simplest kindnesses, can leave us feeling more human. Little did I know that by 7 o'clock the next morning, my doorbell would be ringing incessantly, and I would open it to find 3 police officers standing there, their faces grim. "Michael Holloway?" the lead officer asked. Though we knew each other, it was Officer Brennan who'd gone to high school with me. "Yeah, Tim, what's going on?" I asked, confused and still half asleep. "We need to ask you some questions about your interaction with Staff Sergeant James Mercer." My stomach dropped. Had something happened to James? Had he done something? Or worse, had my initial doubts been right, and he wasn't who he claimed to be? "Is everything okay?" I managed to ask. Officer Brennan's expression was unreadable. "That depends on your definition of okay. Can we come in?" I stepped aside, my mind racing. As they entered my apartment, I noticed they were looking around carefully, as if searching for something or someone. "James got on the bus to Cedar Rapids yesterday morning," I said quickly. "I haven't seen him since. What's this about?" The 3 officers exchanged glances, and then Officer Brennan spoke. "Mr. Holloway, are you aware that Staff Sergeant Mercer is being considered for the Medal of Honor?" Of all the things I had expected him to say, that wasn't even on the list. What? No, he didn't mention anything like that." Officer Brennan nodded, as if that confirmed something. "We received a call from Army Command this morning. Apparently, Sergeant Mercer was supposed to be at a ceremony in Des Moines yesterday, but he never showed up. They've been looking for him." I sank into a chair, trying to process this information. "He didn't say anything about a ceremony. He just said he was heading to his sister's in Cedar Rapids." "That's consistent with what we know," another officer chimed in. "His sister reported that he called her yesterday evening to say he'd arrived safely." I was still confused. "So why are you here? And at 7 in the morning?" Officer Brennan's stern expression finally softened a bit. "Because Mike, when they started tracking his movements to figure out where he'd been, your name came up. Your friend Dave mentioned your text about letting a soldier stay in your truck. The Army is very interested in talking to you." "Me? Why?" I was genuinely baffled. "Because," Officer Brennan said, "they think you might be able to shed some light on why a man who saved an entire platoon by carrying wounded soldiers through enemy fire, a man who's being awarded the nation's highest military honor, would choose to skip his own ceremony to sleep in a stranger's truck in the rain." The room seemed to tilt slightly. James hadn't mentioned any of this. He'd been so matter-of-fact about his injuries, so humble in his demeanor. Nothing about him had screamed hero in the conventional sense, and yet, "I had no idea," I said honestly. "We believe you," Officer Brennan assured me. "But there's someone else who'd like to hear exactly what happened between you two. They're waiting at the station." That's how I found myself, still in my pajama pants and hastily thrown-on jacket, sitting in an interview room at the Millfield police station across from a stern-looking Army colonel named Harrington. "Mr. Holloway," he began without preamble, "I'd like you to tell me everything about your interaction with Staff Sergeant Mercer from the moment you met him until he left your company. Leave nothing out, no matter how insignificant it might seem." So I did. I told him about the rain, about offering my truck, about the coffee and egg sandwiches the next morning. I told him about James cleaning my windows and organizing my console. I told him about the shower, the borrowed clothes, the conversation over coffee. Throughout my recounting, the colonel took notes and occasionally asked clarifying questions, but his expression remained neutral. When I finished, he sat back and studied me for a long moment. "Mr. Holloway, are you aware that Sergeant Mercer has been declining all public recognition for his actions in Afghanistan? That it took a direct order from his commanding officer to get him to agree to attend the ceremony at all?" I shook my head. "No, sir. Like I said, he barely mentioned Afghanistan, and nothing about any medals." The colonel nodded slowly. "That's consistent with his character. What you may not understand is that men like James Mercer don't see themselves as heroes. They see themselves as soldiers who did their job. The fact that his job involved running into enemy fire 5 times to rescue wounded comrades, despite sustaining severe burns himself, is something he views as simply fulfilling his duty. I thought about James's demeanor, formal, reserved, uncomfortable with gratitude. It made more sense now. The ceremony has been rescheduled, the colonel continued. And this time, we're making sure he attends. But he's requested something unusual. What's that? I asked. He's asked that you be present. He specifically mentioned that he would feel more comfortable if, and I quote, the kind of civilian who embodies the values I fought to protect was there to witness it. I felt a surge of emotion I couldn't quite name. Pride, humility, astonishment. I don't understand. All I did was offer him my truck for one night. The colonel leaned forward. Mr. Holloway, what you might not appreciate is how rare simple kindness can seem to someone coming back from war. Sergeant Mercer has spent years in an environment where every stranger is a potential threat, where trust can get you killed, where hypervigilance is a survival skill. And then he meets you, a complete stranger who offers shelter without question, who brings coffee and food, who opens his home and provides clean clothes. He paused, letting his words sink in. In the context of where he's been and what he's experienced, your simple kindness was extraordinary. It represented everything he's been fighting for, the idea that people can be good to each other without agenda, that community and compassion still exist in the world he's been defending from afar. I didn't know what to say. I thought about my father again, about his struggles to readjust, about the walls he'd built between himself and the civilian world that couldn't understand what he'd been through. Will you attend the ceremony, Mr. Holloway? The colonel asked. It's in Des Moines, next Friday. The Army will arrange transportation. Of course, I said without hesitation. I'd be honored. The colonel stood and extended his hand. Thank you. And thank you for showing one of our best that the America he fought for still exists in the small acts of its citizens. As I shook his hand, I thought about how random life can be, how a rainstorm and a missed bus had connected me to a genuine hero, how a simple offer of shelter had apparently meant more than I could have imagined. The ceremony in Des Moines was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. The governor was there, along with high-ranking military officials and a crowd of distinguished guests. And yet, among all the medals and uniforms, James sought me out immediately, now dressed in his formal military attire, adorned with rows of ribbons and commendations. "Mike," he said, shaking my hand firmly, "thank you for coming." "Wouldn't have missed it," I replied truthfully. "Though you could have mentioned you were kind of a big deal." A small smile finally cracked his serious expression. "I'm not. I just did what anyone in my unit would have done." "That's not what your colonel tells me." James shrugged uncomfortably. "They exaggerate." Later, when the citation was read aloud, detailing how he'd repeatedly risked his life under heavy enemy fire to carry wounded soldiers to safety, how he'd used his own body to shield a fallen comrade from an explosion, sustaining severe burns in the process, how he'd continued to return to the battlefield despite his injuries until every member of his platoon was accounted for. I understood that no one was exaggerating anything. The man who had quietly slept in my truck, who had meticulously cleaned my windows as payment for shelter, was the kind of hero most of us only read about. And yet, when he received the Medal of Honor, the highest decoration for valor in combat, he looked almost embarrassed by the attention. At the reception afterward, James introduced me to his sister, Emily, a kind-faced woman who hugged me immediately. "Thank you," she whispered. "He told me what you did." "It was nothing," I insisted, increasingly uncomfortable with the gratitude I was receiving for what still seemed like such a small act. It wasn't nothing to him, she said, pulling back to look me in the eye. You have to understand, James has struggled since coming home. He doesn't sleep well. He doesn't trust easily. The fact that he accepted your help, that he felt safe enough to sleep in your truck, that's huge. Later, when James and I had a moment alone, I had to ask, why did you want me here today? There must be people who deserve this honor much more than I do. James considered my question with the same seriousness he seemed to apply to everything. When I was standing in that rain, I was at a low point. I'd missed my bus. I was dreading this ceremony, dreading having to stand in front of people and be celebrated for the worst day of my life. A day when I lost friends, despite everything I did. He paused, looking out over the reception. And then you came along, someone who had no obligation to help me, who knew nothing about me, who could have just walked by. But you didn't. You showed me that the random kindness of strangers, the basic goodness of people looking out for each other, that's real. That's worth fighting for. He turned to face me directly. You asked me once what my plan was, now that I'm out of the service. I've been struggling with that question for months, but after meeting you, I think I know. I want to work with veterans, help them reintegrate, remind them that the world has good people in it who care. I felt a surge of emotion at his words. I think you'd be great at that. He nodded, a decision seemingly made. Your dad, he found purpose in creating things after seeing destruction. I think I can find purpose in rebuilding trust for those who've seen the worst of humanity. 2 years have passed since that rainy night in the parking lot. James now runs a veteran support program in Cedar Rapids, helping former soldiers find housing, employment, and community. We've stayed in touch, and I've even helped him build furniture for some of the transitional housing units his program manages. Sometimes people ask me how it feels to have played a small role in the story of a Medal of Honor recipient, but that's not how I see it. I don't think of James as the hero who slept in my truck. I think of him as the man who taught me that heroism comes in many forms, sometimes in dramatic acts of battlefield courage, but more often in small daily choices to be kind, to help where we can, to create connections in a world that can feel increasingly disconnected. I still have the truck, though I've upgraded a few things inside it, and in the glove box, I keep a small framed photo of James receiving his medal. Not to remind me that I once helped a hero, but to remind me that we never know whose life we might touch with a simple act of kindness. That on any ordinary rainy night, we might have the chance to be the person someone needs, even if we never know the full impact of our actions. The officers at my door that morning changed my perspective forever. They showed me that sometimes the smallest gestures can mean everything to someone who's carrying invisible burdens. And that the true measure of our humanity isn't found in grand gestures or public recognition, but in how we treat each other when no one is watching, when there's nothing to be gained, when all we have to offer is a dry place to sleep on a rainy night. That experience with James changed my life forever, and I'm grateful that I could share it with you today. If this story touched you, please consider subscribing to Honor Echoes, where we bring you powerful stories of veterans and the impact they make in our communities. Hit that subscribe button and notification bell so you never miss a new story. And if you know a veteran who needs support, remember that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can make the biggest difference. Until next time, this is Honor Echoes, where veterans' stories live on.